It began on a quiet street in the town of Elkford, a place where the winters clung like stubborn ghosts, and the summers were short-lived reprieves. People there didn't speak much about tragedy, not because they didn't have any, but because they had learned that words only stirred up the ashes. NTHE crime that would forever remain unsolved started on the night of February 14, 1989. The date alone gave people something to remember it by, though the event itself burned it permanently into their minds. It wasn't a lover's night in Elkford that year. Snow fell in thick, slow drifts, the wind pressing against windows with a hollow whistle. Margaret Dean, a 47-year-old librarian, left the town library at exactly 8:03 p.m., according to the only clock in the building that worked. She had been the library's caretaker for nearly 2 decades, a woman who knew every regular patron by name and could find any book in seconds without checking the catalog. She lived alone in a modest, cedar-sided house less than a 15-minute walk from work. She never owned a car, never needed one. NSHE never made it home. And at 8:17 p.m., a neighbor, Harold Smalls, claimed to have seen Margaret passing by the corner of Willow and Green Street. She waved to him, carrying a tote bag, her scarf pulled tight against the cold. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive, NBY 10 p.m. Her house remained dark, and her friend Ellen, who lived 2 streets over, called the library thinking Margaret had perhaps stayed late. When she learned Margaret had left hours earlier, she walked to her house to check on her. The snow by then had thickened to knee level in drifts, swallowing sound and light. When Ellen arrived, she found something odd. There were no fresh footprints leading to the front door. In fact, the walkway looked untouched since earlier that morning. NTHE police arrived within the hour, their flashlights casting long, nervous shadows over the blank snow. They retraced Margaret's path back toward the library, scanning for anything unusual. They found her tote bag half a block from her house. It was lying on its side, the books inside arranged neatly, untouched by snow, as if it had only been set down moments before discovery. The police noted the oddness. No drag marks, no scuffle in the snow, no other footprints except hers, which simply stopped. NTHE search intensified the following morning. Dozens of townsfolk joined the officers, combing every yard, alley, and patch of forest near her route. By the second day, the search expanded to the frozen creek on the edge of town. No body was found. And weeks passed. The snow melted, revealing cigarette butts, bottle caps, scraps of paper, but nothing linked to Margaret. Then, on April 6th, a boy named Timmy found something while playing near the creek. It was a single mitten, red wool. Inside the mitten was a small slip of paper, folded so many times it was soft at the creases. On it were the words N. She came willingly. NN01 recognized the handwriting. No fingerprints were found. NTHE police leaned toward the possibility of an abduction, but there was no ransom note, no demands, and no evidence of forced entry or struggle. Some whispered about a stalker. Others claimed Margaret had grown quiet in the weeks before she vanished, her attention always drawn to something outside the library windows at night. NTHE's strangest account came from an elderly man named Walter, who swore he saw Margaret days after she disappeared. He claimed he was walking past an abandoned house on Hunter's Road when he spotted her silhouette in the upstairs window. When he called her name, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. NTHE house was searched thoroughly. Dust coated every surface, spiderwebs undisturbed. The windows upstairs were locked from the inside, and years passed, and the case grew colder. Every few years, something strange surfaced. Someone would receive an anonymous postcard with nothing but a single word written in neat script, N North. NN01 could connect the message to Margaret, yet those who remembered her disappearance couldn't shake the feeling it was meant for them. In 2003, a new lead emerged when a hiker found bones deep in Elkford Forest, more than 6 miles from town. The remains were partial and weather-worn. Forensic tests suggested they belonged to a woman in her late 40s, but DNA was too degraded to confirm. NTHE mitten with the note had long been lost from the evidence room. The police insisted it was misplaced during an office relocation. Locals suspected it had been taken or destroyed by someone who knew too much. NTO this day. Margaret Dean's fate remains a whisper in Elkford. The library still stands, and the clock above the desk still ticks. But if you ask certain old-timers, they'll tell you. On snowy February nights when the streets are empty, you might hear the faint sound of boots in the snow, stopping just before they reach your door. And if you ever find a mitten in your path, they say, don't pick it up. The year was 1974, and the city of Brunswick was in the middle of one of its harshest summers on record. The air shimmered above the asphalt, the sun bearing down on empty streets like a watchful eye. The kind of heat that made tempers short and shadows long. In the middle of that relentless season, the Parker Building stood like a relic from another time. 12 stories of weathered brick and blackened windows, a mix of offices and small apartments. Its elevator groaned with every ride, its hallways smelled faintly of dust and boiled cabbage, and its residents kept to themselves. On the morning of August 19th, a maintenance worker named Glenn Morris was called to the 10th floor to check a complaint about a flickering hallway light. When he arrived, he noticed something strange. Apartment 10B's door was wide open. The tenant, a 32-year-old accountant named James Dwyer, was nowhere in sight, and Glenn called out, but no one answered. He stepped inside. The apartment was immaculate, so clean it felt unnatural. The kitchen table was set for one, with a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, steam still rising from the cup. The eggs were untouched. NTHE television was on, tuned to static. A single chair was positioned directly in front of it, as if James had been watching the blank screen. And in the bedroom, the bed was neatly made. On the pillow lay James's wallet, watch, and apartment keys. The window was wide open, letting in the oppressive summer air, and Glenn reported it to the building manager, who contacted the police. They searched the apartment top to bottom. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing missing. The only oddity was the bathroom. The tub was filled to the brim with ice water. Floating in it were several freshly cut flowers, white chrysanthemums, their petals drifting silently in the cold. Neighbors said they had seen James the night before, around 9 p.m., carrying a small cardboard box up the stairs. No one saw him leave. NTHE investigation revealed that James was a quiet man with no criminal record, no known enemies, and no debts. He had lived in the Parker Building for 6 years without incident. His co-workers described him as polite but distant, a man who always declined invitations to after-work drinks. NTWO weeks later, the police received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a Polaroid photograph. It showed James sitting at a table in an unfamiliar room, wearing the same shirt from the day he vanished. In front of him was a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, identical to the one left behind in his apartment. His hands were folded neatly in his lap. His eyes were closed. Written on the back of the photograph in red ink were the words, "N. He has agreed." Forensics determined the handwriting did not match James's. The room in the photo had no windows, only plain white walls. The photograph had been taken on instant film no longer widely sold, the kind that left a faint chemical smell even after years. NTHE lead detective Ellen Marston pursued every angle. The box James had carried that night was never found. His bank accounts remained untouched, and there were no calls from his phone after the day he vanished. The tub of ice water baffled investigators, especially since there was no ice in the apartment when police arrived. In 1981, a fire broke out in the Parker Building, destroying most of the upper floors, including apartment 10B. During the reconstruction, workers discovered something behind the drywall, a small space, no bigger than a closet, with a chair facing a blank section of wall. On the floor were several dried, crumbling chrysanthemum petals. James's case remains unsolved. The photograph was locked away in the evidence archive, though a rumor persists that a second photo exists, one never made public, showing James with his eyes open. And, they say, in that second photograph, his pupils are so wide, there's nothing left but black. It began in the coastal town of Fair Harbor, Maine, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. The streets were narrow, paved with uneven cobblestones that glistened after the morning fog lifted. The ocean was always near, its brine carried on the wind, the gulls wheeling overhead in slow, lazy circles. Fair Harbor was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stood out like ripples on still water. On November 3, 1987, those still waters were disturbed. NTHE Wilkins family had lived on Cross Street for generations. Their small blue house, tucked between two salt-weathered Victorians, had peeling paint and a leaning fence, but it was warm inside, smelling always of cinnamon and wood smoke. It was there that Margaret Wilkins, 62 years old and recently widowed, lived with her grandson Daniel, who had just turned 15. NTHAT morning, a neighbor named Mrs. Hanley noticed something odd as she hung laundry on the line. The Wilkins' front door was wide open. It wasn't unusual for Margaret to let in the crisp sea air, but on that particular morning the wind was strong enough to slam the door shut. Yet it stood there, unmoving, NMRs. Hanley called out but received no reply. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The house was silent, except for the ticking of a wall clock in the kitchen. On the dining table sat 2 plates of breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast, both untouched, the food still faintly warm. Margaret's knitting lay on the arm of her chair, her glasses folded neatly beside it. Daniel's school books were stacked on the couch. There were no signs of a struggle. It was as if they had both been in the middle of their morning routine and simply walked away. NTHE police were called. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of either Margaret or Daniel. Daniel's bicycle was still locked in the shed, and Margaret's purse containing her wallet and keys was on the kitchen counter. The only unusual thing in the entire house was found in Daniel's bedroom. On his desk was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. Written in large block letters with a steady, deliberate hand were the words, N. There are more windows than you think. NTHE handwriting did not match Daniel's or Margaret's. Detective Howard Kemp, a methodical man with a reputation for catching small-town liars, took the lead on the case. He interviewed neighbors, combed through Daniel's school records, and even brought in specialists to check the Wilkins home for hidden entrances or crawl spaces. None were found. NTHE days passed. The townspeople whispered about abductions, cults, even ghost stories told by fishermen who swore that sometimes, on foggy mornings, you could see faces looking back at you from the waves. A week later, something happened that froze Detective Kemp's blood. NHE received a plain brown envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a Polaroid photograph. It showed Margaret and Daniel sitting side by side in what looked like a small, windowless room. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide open, staring directly into the camera. Neither looked frightened, but neither looked quite alive. Between them, on the wall behind their chairs, was a single rectangular shape. It was not a picture frame. It was not a mirror. It was a window. And beyond that window was nothing but black. The FBI became involved. They analyzed the photograph, but there was nothing in it that could be traced. No fingerprints, no discernible background noise, no objects that could indicate location. The film type was still being manufactured, which made narrowing the purchase point impossible. NSIX months later, in May of 1988, another envelope arrived at the Fair Harbor Police Department. This time, inside was not a photograph, but a blueprint. It was drawn in precise architectural detail, labeled Wilkins House. The layout was identical to the real home, except for one addition, a small rectangular room directly behind Daniel's bedroom. In the blueprint, that room contained a single chair, facing a wall with a single, perfectly drawn window. Detective Kemp ordered another search of the house. Walls were measured, floorboards lifted, even sections of siding removed. But the room in the blueprint simply didn't exist. And over the years, a handful of residents in Fair Harbor claimed to see the Wilkinses, once in the bakery, once on the pier, once in the church during a midnight mass. In every case, the sighting was fleeting, and when followed, the pair would turn a corner and vanish. NTHE case remains open. The blueprint and the photograph are kept in an evidence locker that newer officers often avoid touching, and sometimes, rarely, but enough to notice. Police clerks swear that when they open the locker, the photograph is different. Sometimes the window in the background isn't black. Sometimes it shows another room entirely. And in that other room, there's always another window. The town of Weatherford, Massachusetts, had been dying for years before anyone noticed. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines or tourist brochures. The main street was a crooked stretch of asphalt lined with shuttered shops, faded signage, and a single diner that stayed open more out of habit than profit. The Weatherford River, once bustling with fishermen, was now clogged with weeds, the water thick and slow. NBUT in the winter of 1972, something began to happen that even the oldest residents couldn't explain. And it started with the Keating family. They lived in a sprawling, lopsided farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with drafty windows and a roof that sagged in the middle. And on January 14th, Robert Keating walked into the sheriff's office with his two young daughters, Hannah and Lillian. His wife, Evelyn, had gone missing in the middle of the night. The strange part wasn't that she had vanished without a trace. It was that Robert swore he'd been holding her hand when it happened. They'd been asleep, he told Sheriff Ellison. At around 2:43 a.m., he woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. When he opened his eyes, Evelyn was lying beside him, her breathing slow and even. He reached for her hand, intending to wake her, but as soon as his fingers closed around hers, her hand began to grow cold. So cold he swore frost formed on his skin, and then she was gone. An NOT pulled away. Not rising from the bed. Just gone. Robert sat there in the dark, clutching nothing but the indentation in the sheets where she had been. NTHE sheriff assumed it was grief talking. Robert had been drinking heavily in recent years. Evelyn had been seen walking alone at night near the riverbank. Maybe she'd simply left. But when deputies searched the property, they found something unusual in the snow outside the Keatings' bedroom window, a trail of footprints that didn't match any known shoe or boot. The prints were narrow, the heel almost non-existent, the toes long and slightly curved. They continued for 27 paces before vanishing entirely in the middle of an unbroken field. 2 weeks later, something similar happened to another family. This time, it was 11-year-old Tommy Bright, who disappeared from his bed sometime between midnight and dawn. His parents swore the boy had been afraid of the dark for his entire life and wouldn't even go to the bathroom at night without waking one of them. Deputies searched Tommy's room and found the same strange footprints in the snow outside his window, though this time the prints were accompanied by something else. Between each step, in a perfectly straight line, lay a small, dark object. At first they thought they were stones, but when examined under a magnifying glass, they turned out to be teeth. Human teeth, each one worn smooth, as if from years of grinding NBY March, there were 4 more disappearances. The victims varied in age and gender: an elderly widow, a high school history teacher, a newborn taken from its crib. But every scene had the same three elements. No signs of forced entry, those narrow, inhuman footprints, and, in at least half the cases, a neat line of smooth, human teeth in the snow. Sheriff Ellison, who'd been Weatherford's lawman for over 2 decades, began to keep a journal of the events. His entries grew increasingly frantic as the months wore on. In one, dated April 5, 1972, he wrote N. They're not taking them to hurt them. They're taking them to build something that needs pieces. I think the teeth are a kind of currency. NTHE final entry, dated May 19, 1972, reads only N. I heard it outside my window last night. The tapping is getting faster. I don't think I have much time. NTHAT was the night Sheriff Ellison disappeared. His deputy found the office unlocked the next morning. The journal was still on his desk, open to that last page, and next to it sat a small cardboard box. Inside were 24 smooth human teeth. NN01 has ever solved the Weatherford vanishings. Over the years, amateur investigators have tried to trace the pattern, noting that every disappearance happened exactly 28 days after the last. Some believe the footprints belong to a human wearing a ritualistic prosthetic. Others think the culprit was something far older than the town itself, something that took the shape of a person only long enough to lure you to the window. And in Weatherford, they still tell children not to look outside after midnight if they hear tapping nesting, because sometimes the tapping means they're already looking in. In the summer of 1988, the residents of Barrows End, Vermont, began to notice that their mail was arriving late. At first, it was a minor irritation. Postcards from vacationing relatives delayed by a day or two, utility bills arriving just past their due dates. But by mid-July, deliveries were being missed altogether. NTHE Town's mail carrier Harold Bell had worked the same route for 32 years. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with a crooked posture and a peculiar habit of humming old waltzes under his breath as he worked. Harold was known for his reliability. He'd once delivered mail during a blizzard so severe it buried half the cars on Main Street, trudging from house to house with a shovel in one hand and his mailbag in the other. Which is why it startled everyone when Harold began making mistakes. At first, he blamed the sorting center in Montpelier, said they'd been short-staffed, and the new clerks didn't know the routes like they used to. But then people started receiving the wrong mail entirely. A woman on Willow Lane found a stack of letters addressed to a man who died 12 years earlier. A farmer on the edge of town received a package that was meant for someone in another county altogether. It all might have been written off as simple incompetence, except for what was in the letters. Every one of the misdelivered envelopes, no matter who the intended recipient was, contained the same thing: a single sheet of pale yellow paper on which was typed the phrase, "I'm almost there." The letters had no return address, no postmark, and no stamp. The envelopes were perfectly sealed, yet when opened, the glue was dry, as though it had never been moistened. When the townsfolk brought these strange letters to Harold, he seemed confused. said he'd never seen them before and swore they weren't in his bag when he began his route. NBUT. Then, sometime in August, they started arriving even when Harold wasn't working. One night, Marjorie Pike, who lived alone in a small white house near the town line, heard a soft thud against her front porch around 2:15 a.m. She peeked out the window and saw no one, but when she opened her door, there was an envelope sitting on the welcome mat. Inside, in the same yellow paper, was the phrase, "N, I'm on your street." NTWO nights later, she got another. N, I'm at your corner. NBY the time the third letter arrived, reading, I'm at your door. Marjorie had already called the sheriff. Sheriff Lester Brand was a practical man, gruff, a little tired, but not prone to panic. He collected the letters, dusted them for prints, and found nothing. The paper and ink were unremarkable, available at any office supply store. The envelopes were mass-produced, the kind you could buy by the box. 3 days after Marjorie's last letter, she disappeared. NHER house was locked from the inside. No windows were broken. The only sign that anything had happened at all was a yellow envelope lying on her kitchen counter. It said, I'm inside. And after that, the letters began arriving in more homes. Never to everyone at once, but always to 1 or 2 residents at a time. They seemed to follow a progression. First, I'm almost there. Then, I'm on your street. Then, I'm at your corner. Then, I'm at your door. And finally, I'm inside. NN01 ever received a letter after that last one. NTHE pattern was so precise that people began trying to intervene. Families packed up and left town when they got the second or third letter. They boarded up their windows, slept in shifts, and kept loaded shotguns beside the bed. It made no difference. NT-hos who fled were found days later, miles away. Their vehicles parked neatly at rest stops or on the shoulder of a highway, locked, empty, and with a yellow envelope resting on the driver's seat. NBY September, Harold Bell had stopped showing up for work entirely. The post office was locked, the blinds drawn. When the sheriff pried open the door, he found Harold's mailbag on the counter. Inside were 6 yellow envelopes, each one sealed, each addressed to a different house in Barrow's End. They were all at the same stage, and I'm at your door. Sheriff Brand burned them on the spot, but the next morning, each intended recipient reported finding the same letter waiting on their kitchen tables. NTHE letters continued until there were no more residents to receive them. By October, Barrow's End was a ghost town. Houses stood with dishes still in the sink, televisions still humming in empty living rooms. The sheriff's cruiser sat abandoned in the middle of Main Street, driver's door open, engine off. On the dashboard was a yellow envelope. It read, N, I'm at your car. NTO this day. No one knows who or what sent the letters. Urban legend says that if you find a yellow envelope in your mailbox with the words, I'm almost there, you have less than a week before the sequence runs its course. And if you try to throw it away, they say the next one just comes faster. In the quiet countryside of New Hampshire, there is a church that the locals speak of only in hushed tones. St. Augustine's in the hamlet of Black Hollow. It is a pale gray wooden chapel, perched at the edge of a dense forest where the trees grow close together, blocking sunlight and swallowing sound. To an outsider, it might look quaint, but to those who have lived here long enough, it is the place where the voices were stolen. NTHE event is officially listed as a tragic disappearance in old police records, but among the town's older residents, it is known by a different name, the night the choir fell silent. It happened in December of 1964. The children's choir of St. Augustine's, 12 in total, aged between 8 and 14, were rehearsing for the Christmas service. The evening snow had begun falling early, muffling the sound of the world outside. Their music instructor, Mrs. Evelyn Hart, was at the piano, leading them through "Hark! The Herald Angels Sing." The last person to see them alive, other than Mrs. Hart, was the pastor, Father Rowe, who claimed he stepped outside for a moment to light the lanterns along the church path. When he returned, the piano was still playing. But there was no one there. NTHE choir's robes were found lying neatly on the pews. Music sheets were scattered across the floor, as though a sudden wind had torn them from the stands. The back door was open, but no footprints marked the fresh snow outside. Mrs. Hart sat at the piano, her fingers moving stiffly over the keys in a halting, broken version of the hymn. When Father Rowe approached her, she whispered only 4 words before collapsing. They sang it back. NSHE never spoke again. In the weeks that followed, search parties combed the woods. No bodies were found. There were no signs of abduction, no blood, no struggle. The snow had been untouched, as if no one had left the church at all. But some locals began to recall strange things in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. A few said they'd heard the children singing at odd hours, not at the church, but from somewhere deep in the forest, the notes rising through the trees on windless nights. One hunter claimed he followed the sound one evening and came upon a clearing where 12 figures stood in a circle, all dressed in white. He insisted they weren't children at all, but things that were too tall, their mouths too wide, and their voices. Wrong. NTHE police dismissed such claims, chalking them up to grief and hysteria. Yet one detail persisted in almost every account. The song they were singing wasn't in English. 50 years later, the church remains locked and unused. The town pays for it to be maintained, but no one will enter after dark. Some say if you stand in the forest behind it at night, you can hear faint voices, soft, high, and mournful, repeating a strange melody that seems to twist and bend in impossible ways. One winter, a group of paranormal researchers came to Black Hollow. They brought recording equipment, EMF meters, and thermal cameras. They managed to capture a sound inside the church that, when slowed down, revealed harmonies far too complex for human throats. At the end of the recording, a single child's voice whispered something in a language no linguist could identify. A week after releasing their findings online, all three researchers vanished from their homes in different states. The only clue was a single sheet of music left on each of their desks. The notes were identical and matched the arrangement the choir had been rehearsing the night they vanished. NN01 knows where the 12 children of Black Hollow went, or what exactly sang back to them that night. Some believe they were taken by something ancient in the woods, something that wanted their voices. Others think they were pulled into another place entirely, a place where the rules of music and speech are not meant for human minds. Every December, on the anniversary, the snow falls thicker in Black Hollow, and the air outside the chapel hums with a low, almost musical vibration. If you listen too long, the sound begins to mimic your breathing, then your heartbeat, and then, unnervingly, your voice. NTHE townsfolk know better than to linger. They say the choir is still out there, waiting for someone foolish enough to sing along. Indian. On the evening of September 12, 1996, the small riverside town of Belmere was bathed in the warm amber light of the setting sun. Its narrow streets, lined with Victorian-era homes and overgrown gardens, gave the impression of a place untouched by time. But beneath the quaint veneer, there was a silence, the kind that follows a sound you didn't realize had stopped until you strained to hear it again. That silence began the day Emily Harrow disappeared. Emily was 24, a recent graduate in forensic anthropology, and the youngest daughter of the Harrow family, a lineage known in Belmere for their wealth and their eerily private lifestyle. Her father, Leonard Harrow, owned the town's only shipping dock, while her mother, Clara, rarely appeared in public. Emily, by contrast, was known for her curiosity, her love of the outdoors, and her habit of walking alone near the abandoned Harrow foundry, a sprawling structure of rust and shadows that had been shut down for decades. And on that particular September evening, Emily had been seen walking toward the foundry, carrying a brown leather satchel. Several townsfolk later recalled seeing her silhouette against the twilight, her long coat swaying in the breeze. That was the last confirmed sighting, and when she didn't return home by midnight, her parents called the police. In Belmere, crime was so rare that the local officers spent more time dealing with trespassing teens than anything violent. At first, they assumed Emily had gone to visit friends, or perhaps driven to the next town. But as hours turned into days, and no one came forward with any information, the mood shifted from casual concern to palpable dread. Detective Howard Pritchard, a man with a thinning hairline and a voice like gravel, led the investigation. He began by searching the foundry, a massive, dust-choked labyrinth of broken catwalks and rusting machinery. Deep in its belly, he found Emily's satchel, torn at the strap, as if ripped away in a struggle. Inside was her notebook, several pencils, and a folded map of the foundry grounds. The last page of the notebook was unsettling. A hastily drawn diagram of the foundry floor with a circle marked in red ink. There was no explanation. Rumors quickly began to spread through Belmere. Some said Emily had uncovered something in her research about the foundry's history. A history that was, in truth, more sinister than most townsfolk liked to discuss. In the late 1800s, Several workers had died in accidents there, though whispers claimed the deaths were intentional, part of an insurance scheme. Others believed the Harrow family themselves had used the foundry for illegal dealings long after it closed. And Pritchard pursued every lead. He questioned her friends, professors, and even the few dock workers who had been close to the Harrow family. But one name kept resurfacing: Samuel Wren, a local handyman who'd once worked odd jobs for the Harrows and who had been seen lingering near the foundry on the night of Emily's disappearance. When questioned, Samuel insisted he had been there to salvage scrap metal, but his alibi had gaps. He denied knowing anything about the satchel or the red circle on the map. The police searched his small apartment above the hardware store, but found nothing incriminating. Weeks passed, and the investigation stalled. Emily's parents withdrew from public life entirely, refusing to speak to reporters or attend community meetings. Pritchard, unwilling to let the case go cold, decided to dig into the Harrow family's past. What he found was a trail of inconsistencies: land purchases under false names, missing town records from the years the foundry was operational, and, most disturbingly, a newspaper clipping from 1924 describing the unexplained disappearance of another young Harrow woman, Margaret, whose case had never been solved. In the winter of 1996, Belmere was struck by heavy snow. The foundry, now completely abandoned, stood like a frozen monument to decay. It was during this time that a group of teenagers, exploring the site on a dare, found something buried beneath the concrete floor in the circled area on Emily's map. It was a shallow grave. Inside was a fragment of fabric that matched the coat Emily had been wearing, along with strands of her auburn hair, but there was no body. NNTHE discovery reignited the town's paranoia. Some claimed Emily had been killed and her body moved. Others whispered about the Harrows' involvement, suggesting a cover-up. The police intensified their search, but every lead dissolved into nothing. Leonard Harrow died of a heart attack the following spring, taking whatever he knew to his grave. Clara Harrow sold their estate and left town soon after, never to be seen again. NTO this day, no one knows what happened to Emily Harrow. The satchel, the map, and the red circle remain the only tangible clues. Detective Pritchard retired in 2004, still haunted by the case. "She's out there somewhere," he told a local paper on the day he left the force. But Belmere doesn't want the truth. It never did. And so the foundry stands, a hollow, rusting reminder of a young woman's final steps. When the wind cuts through its shattered windows at night, it's said you can hear the echo of footsteps pacing slowly in the dark, as if someone is still searching for the way out. In the fog-drenched outskirts of Ashford, Massachusetts, an old stone bridge arches over a narrow Blackwater River. The bridge is older than the town itself, its stones mismatched and weathered, as though taken from other ruins far older than anyone dares to guess. Most who live here avoid it after sunset, for fear of meeting the figure they call the Widow of Ashford Bridge. NTHE earliest recorded account comes from 1892, when a young man named Thomas Lyle was found floating in the river below. His lungs were full of water, though the current was too slow to have pulled him under. His hands were clenched tightly, and in one palm was a sodden scrap of lace, black, frayed, and smelling faintly of decay. NHE had been courting a local woman, Margaret Vale, whose husband had drowned in that very river the year before. She was said to have been inconsolable, often seen wandering the bridge at night in a long black dress, gazing down at the water as though speaking to someone unseen. Then, one evening, she vanished. Her home was found locked, her bed unslept in, and her shoes abandoned neatly by the riverbank. No one saw her again. Since then, the legend has grown. Travelers who cross the bridge after dark sometimes claim to see a lone woman in black standing at the midpoint, her back turned, veil trailing in the windless night. Those who call out to her say she turns slowly, revealing not a face, but a pale blur, as if her features have been erased. Worse still are the ones who report hearing her speak. Witnesses describe her voice as soft, almost tender, asking them if they are ready to join him. If they answer yes, or if they fail to answer at all, the next moment they find themselves standing knee-deep in the river below, clothes soaked, lungs burning, with no memory of how they got there. A few have gone missing entirely, their last known location traced to that bridge. In nearly every case, divers recover the same detail. The body clutches a piece of black lace in its fist. One strange element complicates the story. In 1974, a paranormal investigator named Helen Carver claimed she had proof that the widow was not a ghost, but something older. She believed the river was once the site of pagan rituals, its water used for binding unions between the living and the dead. The lace, she argued, was not a mourning veil, but a ceremonial binding cloth. Carver's research ended abruptly when she too disappeared, after telling colleagues she intended to spend the night on the bridge. Her tape recorder was found sitting on the cold stone parapet the next morning, waterlogged but still containing one intact recording. The first half is nothing but static and the sound of her breathing. Then, in the final seconds, a second voice whispers over hers, "I can make you stay." Even now, locals claim the widow appears more often in November, when the fog thickens and the nights grow longer. Sometimes, they say, she is seen not alone, but holding the hand of a tall, shadowed figure whose face is never visible. Both vanish if approached, leaving only a faint wetness on the stones where they stood. And truck drivers have reported stalling engines while crossing, their headlights flickering just long enough to illuminate her pale hands resting on the hood. And on certain nights, those who lean over the railing swear the water below reflects 3 figures instead of 2. Nobody knows if she is truly searching for her drowned husband, or if the he she speaks of is something else entirely, something that still waits in the depths of the Blackwater River. They say if you cross Ashford Bridge at midnight and feel the sudden urge to look over the edge, you must resist. If you see her in the water looking back up at you, you're already standing where she wants you to be. Fair Hollow, Vermont, is the sort of place where the roads bend in on themselves, The forests seem older than memory, and silence carries farther than sound. Few people live there now, but the ones who remain remember the story of the little schoolhouse that was said to vanish. Not in the way buildings crumble or burn, but in the way something might close its eyes. NTHE School was built in 1911, a one-room wooden structure painted white, with a bell tower and a single oak tree shading the front steps. For decades, children from the scattered farms walked miles through the fields to get there. The teacher, Miss Evelyn Crow, was known for her pale eyes and long, quiet pauses between sentences, as if she were listening to someone no one else could hear. NNTHE first incident happened in 1924. A boy named Daniel Pike failed to return home after school. His father found the building empty, desks neatly arranged, the blackboard clean, the wood stove still warm. Miss Crow was nowhere to be seen. The strange part, though, was that the school's front door would not open. Not locked, but sealed, as though the wood itself had fused. By morning it opened easily again, and both Miss Crow and Daniel Pike were inside, sitting at their desks, silent and pale. They offered no explanation, and when asked what had happened, Daniel only said, "We were waiting for the bell." After that, the disappearances began. Once or twice a year, the schoolhouse would be found empty during the day, no footprints in or out. Sometimes it would be gone entirely, the spot where it stood showing only frost-bitten grass, as if nothing had ever been built there. Hours or days later, it would return, the students inside behaving as though no time had passed. By the late 1930s, rumors had spread that Miss Crow had made some sort of pact, that she had not been teaching only children, but something else that waited in the corners of the room. Farmers spoke of seeing shapes moving inside the building long after dark, the bell ringing faintly in windless nights. In 1941, the schoolhouse vanished for the last time. 15 children and Miss Crow disappeared with it. Search parties scoured the woods and riverbanks for weeks, but nothing was found. The only trace was the bell, discovered lying in the grass where the tower had stood, its clapper missing. In 1968, a hunter claimed he found the building deep in the forest, miles from its original location. He said it looked abandoned, but intact, the desks covered in dust, yet the blackboard still bore faint chalk marks spelling the words, "Wait for the bell." Before he could step inside, he heard children laughing softly from somewhere behind him. When he turned, the building was gone. Since then, hikers and wanderers in the Fair Hollow woods sometimes report hearing a school bell in the distance. Some swear they've seen the little white schoolhouse through the trees, smoke curling from the chimney. Those who approach say the windows are dark, but if you look long enough, pale faces begin to appear in the glass, watching, unmoving. NTHE locals say that if you hear the bell, you must not follow it. For if you step inside, the door will close behind you, and you will sit forever at one of those desks, waiting for a lesson that never ends. It was a mild spring morning on April 17, 1965, when Flight Arden 742 took off from Providence, Rhode Island, bound for Chicago. The aircraft, A twin-engine commuter plane carried 26 passengers and 4 crew members. Among them were businessmen, a nurse traveling to see her sister, and a 9-year-old boy returning from visiting his grandparents. The flight was scheduled for 2 hours and 30 minutes. It never arrived. What puzzled investigators wasn't just the disappearance itself. Aircraft vanishings, though rare, were not unheard of. But the way the trail ended, NNTHE plane's last radio contact came 40 minutes into the flight over the rolling hills of upstate New York. The pilot, Captain Leonard Haas, reported clear skies and calm winds. Then he added something unusual. "N control. There's something in front of us. Looks like a storm, but it's not on radar." NTHE recording captured faint murmurs from the co-pilot and a sound like static, though some who have heard the tape insist it wasn't static at all, but a kind of rhythmic breathing. Then, without distress calls, the transmission cut out. Search teams scoured the entire projected flight path. No debris, no oil slicks, no emergency beacons. The flight might as well have been erased from existence. NNTWO weeks later, a farmer in Pennsylvania found a scrap of metal embedded in the soft earth of his field. It bore the faded Arden Airlines logo, but what startled authorities was the condition of the metal. It looked ancient, as if it had been buried for decades. Laboratory analysis later revealed an impossible level of corrosion for something supposedly manufactured just a year prior. Stranger still, in the years that followed, scattered reports came in from people who claimed to have seen the plane in the sky. Not a similar model, the exact plane, always the same number, the same paint job. It was said to appear silently above remote areas, flying low and slow, as if searching for a place to land. Witnesses reported that the windows were dark, but when the sun struck them just right, they could see people inside, unmoving, staring straight ahead. In 1981, a small private aircraft pilot flying over the Great Lakes made a panicked emergency landing, claiming another plane had nearly collided with him. He swore it was Arden 742, but the strangest part was that the plane didn't seem to be solid. He described it as like looking at something underwater, bending and warping around the edges. The FAA dismissed the account as fatigue and poor visibility. Theories abound: hijacking, mechanical failure, government cover-up, even time displacement. The families of those lost on Arden 742 have long since given up hope for answers. Yet, every few years, a new report emerges from somewhere in the Northeast or Midwest. A low, droning hum over the treetops, a flash of silver in the sky, and the glint of an old Arden Airlines logo. The locals say that if you ever see it, you must not wave, for some believe the passengers are still alive inside, trapped in whatever moment took them, and they are looking for someone to join them. On October 14, 1987, just after sunset, 3 high school friends, Michael Carr, Denise Latham, and Peter Holbrook, were walking home along the old Duskwood Bridge. The narrow, rusting structure crossed a slow-moving section of the River Ash, and though it was once used for cars, it had been closed to traffic for over a decade. It was a shortcut the teens took often, especially in autumn, when the air was crisp and the woods surrounding the bridge glowed red and gold. NTHAT evening. They never made it across. NNTHE last confirmed sighting came from a jogger who passed them at the eastern end of the bridge around 6:10 p.m. He recalled them laughing, Denise leaning on the railing, tossing pebbles into the water. The jogger didn't notice anything strange until he reached the western side and heard a sharp metallic clang echo from behind him. When he turned, the bridge was empty. At first, police assumed the teens had slipped into the river. But divers searched for days without finding any bodies. The current there was slow, the water only 12 feet deep in most places. There were no signs of struggle, no dropped belongings, except for one curious detail. At the center of the bridge, investigators found 3 sets of footprints in the thin layer of dust and leaves. They all stopped abruptly in the same place, mid-stride, as if the friends had stepped into nothing. None theories ranged from abduction to a prank gone wrong, but things became stranger over the following months. Denise's mother received a phone call one evening. The line was filled with heavy static, but she swore she heard Denise's voice faintly saying, "Don't come here. The water is black." Before she could respond, the call cut out. Phone company records later showed the call had originated from a payphone that hadn't worked in years. Locals began whispering about the bridge lights. Several residents claimed they had seen pale, flickering orbs hovering just above the river's surface on foggy nights. One fisherman reported that the water beneath the lights rippled as if something massive was moving just under the surface, even when the river was otherwise calm. NNBY 1993. The Duskwood Bridge was completely sealed off with metal gates. That didn't stop urban explorers from sneaking in. In 2004, a group of college students filming a late-night video reported hearing distant laughter and the sound of pebbles hitting the water. When they reviewed the footage later, they noticed something chilling. At one point, 3 faint silhouettes appeared at the center of the bridge, perfectly still, facing the camera. NTO this day, the 3 friends have never been found. The bridge remains closed, though a few daredevils still try to cross it on moonless nights. NTHE old-timers in town give the same warning to anyone tempted. If you hear footsteps behind you on Duskwood Bridge, don't turn around. The moment you do, you might see 3 teenagers smiling at you, and you won't be coming back across. In the summer of 1972, the small farming community of Hollowfield, Iowa, was shaken to its core when 3 families were found brutally murdered in their homes over a single week. The town, known for its quiet cornfields and church picnics, had never experienced anything close to such horror. The murders had no apparent motive, no signs of forced entry, and no fingerprints. Only one strange detail linked the crimes: a single playing card left on the kitchen table of each house, always the ace of spades. NNTHE first murders were discovered on June 4th. The Mallory family, Thomas, his wife Elaine, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Ruth and 6-year-old Peter, were found by a neighbor who stopped by to return a borrowed lawnmower. The door was unlocked. Inside, the neighbor found silence, except for the hum of the refrigerator. In the kitchen, on the table, was the ace of spades, face up, perfectly centered. All four family members were upstairs, each in their beds, appearing as though they were sleeping, until you saw the thin, precise slit at the base of each of their skulls. The coroner would later determine that the killer had used a narrow, sharp blade to sever the spinal cord instantly, a method both swift and unnervingly efficient. NTHE Town was horrified. Sheriff Mark Doolin, a man more accustomed to livestock theft and teenage vandalism, called in the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Forensics scoured the house but found nothing. No footprints, no blood spatter outside of the wounds, no signs of struggle. It was as if the killer had walked in, done their work, and left without disturbing a single thing. 3 days later, on June 7th, it happened again. This time, it was the Carters, an older couple who lived on the outskirts of town. Frank and Mildred Carter were found by their paperboy. The house was immaculate, the door unlocked, and the ace of spades sitting on the kitchen table. They, too, had been killed in their beds with the same surgical precision. The pattern was undeniable, and fear gripped Hollowfield. Rumors began to spread. Some said it was the work of a drifter. Others whispered about old debts and quiet feuds. But there was something about the way the killer left that card, so deliberate, so ritualistic, that made people wonder if this was something deeper, something almost ceremonial. NNTHE third and final murder happened on June 10th. The Reynolds family, parents Robert and Sarah, and their teenage daughter Claire, were found in the exact same condition. The ace of spades sat on the table. Again, no signs of a break-in, no evidence of forced entry, and no traceable forensic evidence. The killer's ability to enter the homes without detection became a central mystery. Hollowfield was a place where everyone locked their doors after the Mallory murders, yet the killer seemed to walk through walls. NBY this time. The FBI had joined the investigation. Agents interviewed everyone in town, from church pastors to farmhands. They found no enemies, no obvious suspects, and no one who could place a stranger in Hollowfield during that week. The murders stopped as abruptly as they began. Months passed with no new leads. Sheriff Doolin became obsessed, spending nights at the station combing through old crime reports from other states. Eventually, he found something. 3 unsolved murders in Kansas from 1965, each involving entire families killed in their beds, each with an ace of spades left behind. In those cases, too, there were no signs of forced entry. But the trail ended there. Whoever the killer was, they had disappeared, leaving behind only fear and unanswered questions. Some in Hollowfield developed theories that bordered on the supernatural. An old farmer claimed he'd seen a man with no shadow walking near the Mallory farm the night of the first murders. A retired schoolteacher swore she saw a figure in a black coat standing at the edge of her driveway on June 6th, but when she looked again, it was gone. Others speculated about a rogue government experiment, an assassin trained to eliminate targets without leaving a trace, an NTO this day, the Hollowfield murders remain unsolved. The case files are locked away in the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation archives, gathering dust. But every few years, a small-town newspaper will run an anniversary piece, and the old fear resurfaces. And even now, when the older residents of Hollowfield set a deck of cards on the table for a game, they remove the ace of spades first. Not because they think the killer will return, but because some things, once seen, never leave you. And in Hollowfield, that card has never been just a card.